talk about what's new and changed in GlassMapper 5. So my name is Shu Jackson. I'm a technical consultant at Proficient. My Twitter handle is at Sitecore Shu. And my
And
co-presenter.
that would be me. Sorry, jumping in. Uh, Courtney Dean, also a technical consultant, Twitter handle at Site Courtney. Um, we've both been working on Sitecore projects the past few years and have used GlassMapper on most of them, which is how we came to this topic. So what is GlassMapper? GlassMapper is a Sitecore ORM created by Sitecore MVP Mike Edwards. What is an ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping. So what does that do for you? It allows you to map two completely different objects to each other. As you can see, this Sitecore template and this C# model are not the same thing, but with GlassMapper, we can map those to each other. Without an ORM, you're going to end up writing a ton of mapping code, which we'll show you examples of. Um, and GlassMapper just takes a lot of that headache away for you, so it's better, to work smarter, not harder. GlassMapper specifically allows you to map data from Sitecore, such as this template, to a strongly typed C# model. For example, in Sitecore, we've got single line text, and we can map that to string in our C# model. So it's not the exact same thing, but we can map them to each other. Okay, slide changed. So here's an example of what it would be like to not use GlassMapper. Instead, you're going to be using the Sitecore API to map all of your fields. And so you can see in here that there's a code difference already. So what exactly are you doing with the Sitecore API? You're having to query Sitecore and get back your item, and then going basically field by field and mapping that over into your model. Again, you can see there's a massive difference. First, the one line, which just get our data source item, versus line by line having to map these. And you can imagine if your model's pretty big, that would be a pain to write that much code. Here's another example with the Sitecore API. The thing to note about this example is it also is mapping child items. So you can see with the Sitecore API, we're having to also include a for each and include that mapping code in the for each, so your child items are also being mapped correctly. In GlassMapper, mapping your Sitecore children is just adding the Sitecore children attribute into your model, and then good to go. You're done. It did your mapping of your children as well for that item. Again, you're looking at much less code, this for each with your mapping code versus Sitecore children attribute handles a lot of stuff for you. So GlassMapper is not a total replacement for the Sitecore API. There are still things you're going to need to use the Sitecore API for. For example, any logic with locking and unlocking items, that's something GlassMapper is not going to be able to do for you. However, to note, there is this attribute Sitecore item, as you can see in this screenshot. And so Sitecore item just gives you access to all of the items fields itself. So down the line, if you did need to do some logic with locking or unlocking, you do already have the item available to you in your model, and so you don't have to, at that point, write mapping code to get the item so you can do your logic with the Sitecore API. You do have Sitecore item available to you in GlassMapper to go ahead and give you access to the item itself.
So how do you install GlassMapper? We install GlassMapper from NuGet, and that brings us the first big change in GlassMapper 5. In previous versions, GlassMapper detects your Sitecore version and install GlassMapper accordingly. And if you are not referencing sitecore.kernel and sitecore.mvc, Glass won't install properly. You'll have to uninstall and reinstall. The key change here is you install by Sitecore version you are working on. So for example, if you are working in Sitecore 9, you will need to install glassmapper.sc.90. So we won't have that issue of forgetting to reference the Sitecore reference and then GlassMapper doesn't install properly. So that issue is gone. So you can see on the right side of the slide for each version, there are three packages, .sc, .mvc, and .core. If you're working on a Helix solution, you can download the main glass.mapper.sc package in a foundation layer and then just install core and MVC in other layers as needed. Talk more about the details of working with Helix specifically towards the end of this presentation. When you install glassmapper.sc, you get two generated files in the app start folder as shown on the left. So if you're working with Helix, they live in your foundation layer. Two things to keep in mind here. One, never change the not custom file. So the first file, never touch that one. Second, if you do want to add your custom configuration, change the second file and be careful that with the custom file, it can be overwritten with the NuGet update. So after installation, how do you use GlassMapper to work with Sitecore? Of course, you should be working with MVC and you will have your model classes or interfaces. You want to configure Glass to map your models to the Sitecore data. There are two ways to configure mapping in GlassMapper, attribute mapping and fluent configuration. On the left side is an example of attribute mapping. You can see we have Sitecore type template ID above the class name line and Sitecore type field ID above each field. Those are there to map to the specific template and fields in Sitecore to your class and the properties in the class. You can also map relationships using Sitecore children, as Courtney just introduced, and also you can use Sitecore item to map to the item itself. Also, Courtney mentioned that. There is also Sitecore query to use queries for mapping, and also Sitecore info, which can map metadata such as item URL. You do have an option of automap to use for mapping field names when the names are the same in Sitecore as in your code, but this is not a good practice because if someone go and change a field name somewhere in your code, it will sorry, change a field name and somewhere in your code it will break because your code will not be the same as the field name. So always use field ID for mapping IDs and try to avoid automap. For the right side, that's Fluent configuration. You can see you need to add some mapping configuration as shown on the top of the right side, and then add the F configuration to the configuration factory as shown in the second picture on the right side. And those configuration again live in the GlassMapper SC custom file that was generated when Glass was installed. Adding this ties out model and configuration together so GlassMapper can map correctly. Both two ways are acceptable ways to do it. It's up to you which one you like. There are opinions on which one is better. Some people will say attribute mapping violates single responsibility principles because it's now having one class taking care of both data structure and mapping configuration. However, on the other hand, attribute mapping is simpler to use. So I personally always like to use attribute mapping because it is simpler. Another great feature Glass provides is the HTML helpers, which allows you to make fields editable in the Experience Editor. You're seeing some example on the slides right now. We have glass.editable for simple fields like text and date time. We have render link for hyperlinks and render image for images. Also, we have edit frames. That's a good one. It's the only way to edit certain types of fields, such as multi-list fields in Experience Editor without having to use rendering parameters. So I usually use that one, editable, edit frame. Um, of course, you don't have to use this. You can still use the plain old model.field name if you don't want it to be editable in your Experience Editor. One thing to keep in mind, make sure you have Sitecore ID on your model or else the mapping wouldn't work. GlassMapper needs the ID to find and write to the Sitecore item.
Okay, so what's new and changed with Glass 5? Shu already touched on the first big change, which is the changes to the NuGet packages. Um, The next big change is that Sitecore Context, Glass View, and Glass Controller are now obsolete. You're not going to be using them anymore. So to go through that, Sitecore Context was responsible for a mixture of database access and request context. Well, now there are new contexts, which you can see further down the slide, that are available and have much clearer functionality. And these new contexts fit closer with the Sitecore architecture. So really for those kind of things, for the request context that you're going to need, you're going to be using these new contexts. So Sitecore context isn't really providing that value to you anymore, hence why it's obsolete. Uh, with Glass View and Glass Controller, um, anything of value we're getting through those, there were other ways to get it or aren't really needed anymore, which is why they're obsolete. So to, again, break that down. With Glass Controller, that was providing you access to Sitecore context. Well, as I just said, Sitecore context is obsolete, so that's not needed anymore. And with Glass Controller, that was how you would get access to data source or rendering parameters for your item. But now your new context, your MVC context, is going to be where you get those values from. So again, not really value needed anymore from Glass Controller. And with Glass View, it allowed you to use the editable method without the HTML helper. So as she was talking about, you would use html.glass.editable, and Glass View just kind of lets you cut out a little bit of that and go straight to editable for your fields to make them editable in Experience Editor. But really, you were getting that view through HTML helper, and there's other things you can get through HTML helper. So not really value added by Glass View. So again, obsolete. Key word in all of this is the word obsolete. So it means it is there now, but it will be deleted. So on an upgrade to Glass Mapper 5, that should probably be number one on the priority list to get those removed. Otherwise, the update will come when they are removed, and if you didn't get it done, code will break and it won't be fun. So yeah, keyword obsolete, make sure these are removed from any existing code base when you do upgrade to Glassmapper 5. Uh, so there are a few more things changing, but we're going to go into those on some other slides. So Sitecore service. Uh, First, what is Sitecore service? It's represents your interface for an individual database. It allows you to perform all of the basic CRUD functions. It's essentially a wrapper for your Sitecore databases, and mainly going to be used when you're accessing items from core database. So before with Sitecore service, there's a lot of attributes you can add. You can see in this example in the updated version infer type and lazy. There's just a lot of attributes you can use when you're getting your item from Sitecore database. And before with Sitecore service, it was just a list of parameters. And with the different versions of how many parameters and which parameters you want, get Sitecore service.get item had at least 30 different overrides. And so you can see that 30 overrides would probably be overwhelming to figure out exactly what you want for what you need done. So now there is a move to using these options classes. You can see the example, we've got an example of get item by ID options. And so that allows you to set up a config map in your options class and then just pass the options to your Sitecore service like get item, and you're done. So the signature is a lot cleaner for your Sitecore service methods. There are many different attributes you can add to your config map. Again, on the example we have infer type and lazy. There's also cache and enforce type and template ID and version and language. There's a good number of attributes you can fit into your options class to make sure you get the item exactly how you would like out of Sitecore. There are multiple options classes. Again, the example we've got is get item by ID, but there's also get item, by path, by query. So you have some options on how you're setting up this options class for Sitecore service. Again, to note, the old way with the long list of parameters, that is being that is being marked obsolete as well. So you're going to want to also make sure to prioritize moving to options class as well, along with the Sitecore Service Glass Controller and Glass View updates.
So this is the first one of the three contexts GlassMapper Firebase offers, IMVC context. It is also probably the one you will be working with the most. You use IMVC context when you are using MVC. This context provides data source, page context, rendering items, and also rendering parameters. It's very straightforward to use, and we will show you an example in the demo session. But under the hood, it's calling Sitecore service to talk to Sitecore. Again, this is mainly used for MVC for controller renderings. The next one is iRequest context. You use request context when you are outside of the controller and do not have a data source available. Common scenarios to use request context include computed fields, pipeline processors, and event handlers. You can get the context item, home item, and the root item. You used to have to get these properties and methods from Glass controller and not be able to use it anywhere else. But now with iRequest context, you can inject the service to wherever you need it. However, I was advised by a colleague, Corey Smith, to never inject it to a pipeline processor as Sitecore has a bug and will break your code. In another talk, Mike Reynolds pointed out that singleton is okay. So if you're using singleton, we can inject into pipeline processor. But if you're using scoped or transient, try to avoid doing that. Instead, using service locator, and we will show you an example of that in the demo later. Again, under the hood, we're calling Sitecore service to talk to Sitecore. So this one, we're not even going to talk about it because do not use web forms.
So the last change is with lazy loading. So before with lazy loading, that was in property configuration you would add on your model. So attribute mapping or fluent configuration, you had to decide basically at the model level if you wanted to use lazy loading for that model or not. Now it is moved so that when you call your item, whether if it's Sitecore service that get item or using your MVC context to get data source item, you can make that decision at that time. So you're not stuck with the one decision all the times you call the model. You can actually decide as you are writing your code and coming into situations whether or not you would like to include lazy loading for that call for the item. And again, you can do this with Sitecore service or using your MVC context. You can decide lazy loading at those times. All right, so I'm going to switch over to a demo, so stand by.
Right now,
Yes.
you're looking at how we are registering services through DI. So we are registering them to the container as scoped, as you can see. So all the contexts are using the same instance of Sitecore service and don't have to create new ones within the same request. Sitecore service is using context database, as you can see there, the first line. So if you do need to access to the core database, you can create a new Sitecore service for core database.
Okay, and I'm going to walk us through an example using MVC context. These are all the examples we've been using the slides, so it'll look familiar, but to just walk through it in one cohesive step. Here's our model. Again, we prefer to use attribute mapping. So here's an example of using attribute mapping for a demo article model. And you can see here we also have the Sitecore item as talked about earlier. So it's pretty basic model here. And then in our controller, you can see we're using the dependency injection, just injecting in our constructor, our MVC context. And so with that done, it's just the one line, get data source item with our demo article model we set up and done. Mapping is done. That was all we had to do to get that set up. And then moving over to our view, again, nothing necessarily new here with GlassMapper 5, but it's an example of our view using the editable fields. Yeah, and we have our images editable and everything. So I'm going to switch to the site, which I'm sure has logged me out. So I'll refresh. As it loads us back in. So this will pull up our experience editor for that demo article. And so you can see that we'll be able to edit that here. So I'll take out a few exclamation points. It's not 4 exclamation points, maybe exciting. Maybe 2 is more reasonable. We'll update the date to today. Yep. Okay. And you can see, I mean, this is all done in here. Save, done. Our model's been updated right here through the experience editor. Yep. Done. So yeah, much nicer for content editors to be able to edit right in the experience editor and can see their changes as they're happening. So yeah, so that's a pretty basic example using MVC context and mapping that model for you. The second example we have is for request context. So as you mentioned, in this instance with a pipeline processor, we're using service locator. So this pipeline processor, it's a not found processor. So if the user were to go to a bad URL, this is basically what would handle that situation for you. So here again, we got a request context set up using service locator, and then we're just using get home item off of the request context and returning that item. So not necessarily a real world use, you wouldn't necessarily just send your user back to the home page. But for this example and showing request context using get home item. So to again show you that it works, we'll come over here and put in a bad URL if I can, yep. And then you will see the out of the box home page. So you can see that we were redirected back to the home page for this example. So yeah, so pretty quick example of using request context, and then we didn't use web forms, so we don't have an example for the web forms context. So yeah, so that's demo. So let's switch back. Slides. Hopefully we're back.
Now, we'd like to introduce you a newest feature brought in Mapper v 5.1 on October 10th. As mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, if you are working with a Helix solution, glassmapper.sc should be only installed in the foundation layer in an ORM project in the foundation layer. What that means is the two generated files when installing the NuGet packages should live in the app start folder in this module in this layer. So we're seeing the structure of how Glass works with Helix on this slide right now. You can see 3 layers, and it's important that glass.mapper.sc NuGet package is only referenced by a single module in the foundation layer. In the feature layer and project layer projects, glassmap.sc.core will always need to be installed. As for glassmapper.sc.mvc, you only install it when needed. So if you're working with MVC and you need access to MVC context, then install glassmapper.isc.mvc in that project. As mentioned before, any custom configuration you need to add needs to be added to the glassmapper.sc custom.cs file, which lives in the foundation layer. So doing Doing this will bring to the solution backward dependency from the foundation layer to the feature layer, which violates the Helix principles because in Helix, foundation modules can only reference other foundation modules. They may not reference feature modules or project modules. In this version 5.1 update, there's a new way to load configurations. So instead of adding the configuration into the custom file in the foundation layer, it can be added using a new cycle pipeline introduced in GlassMapper v5.1. To do this, you create a processor that inherits getGlassLoader's processor in the feature module that you're working with and you need custom glass configuration at. The configurations will be added to this processor. Then add this processor to the glassmapper.getGlassLoaders pipeline. The foundation module code now doesn't need to reference your feature layer anymore. And also, since you don't need to edit glass mapper SC custom.cs file, you don't need to worry about when upgrading glass, your custom file gets overwritten and lose your changes anymore. So two birds. To recap, this is the list of what's new and changed in the new version of Glass Mapper, and we've also put a few links there if you want to read up more on this topic. The first two links are basically whatever is covered in this presentation, and the second two links are the official document from Glassmapper. So questions?
We do have one from Esther. If you guys can see that up on the screen now. So Esther is asking about advantages of Glassmapper over using Synthesis.
I haven't used synthesis, but I know that they basically work differently. Glassmapper is like a mapper, a wrapper around the Sitecore item, and synthesis is like directly mapping to the item from Sitecore. That's about the only knowledge I know the difference between these two. Basically, one is like a wrap around Sitecore items, and the other one is okay. Synthesis is a wrapper. Sorry, I remembered the other way around. Yeah, Mike is answering the question for us.
But I think the general gist of what she was saying there is correct. There is a kind of a difference between the two in regards to
Right,
being a
one is
mapper and a
wrapper.
wrapper.
Right. Yeah, I have been using Glassmapper for all the projects I've worked on, so I don't really
Yeah.
have any experience with synthesis.
Same.
I feel like sometimes there's a split between people that use TDS and people that use Unicorn, and I feel that sometimes Glass and TDS and obviously Unicorn and Synthesis is the general kind of thing of what I see there as well.
Right. Yeah, I use Unicorn and TDS. Yeah, both of them work pretty good. I personally prefer Unicorn.
And there we go. Una's had it look there that Glass uses the T4 and T5 template, and this doesn't for code generation purposes.
Cool.
I think actually, guys, Uno, if you did want to, you can actually chat. Chat. You should be able to unmute yourself, or I can potentially unmute you if Mike and Una, you did want to
Yeah, can
talk
you
at the
do
same.
that? Okay, Mike, you can
Hello,
talk.
can you hear me?
Hey.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yes.
yeah, this is probably easier than typing this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can use Leprechaun with both Glass and Synthesis, which negates having to use T-book templates at all. It's using the .NET Core code gen stuff. And I've used it not with Glass, but I know that Dylan Young has done some stuff with that. But I've used it with Synthesis, and it's pretty cool. It's a lot easier to manage than the T4 templates. I've used
Nice.
both Synthesis and Glass, but mostly Glass. But at the end of the day, they pretty much do the same kind of thing, except it's a little different and the approach is completely different.
Cool. Thanks, Mike.
Cool.
By the way,
And
Leprechaun is made by Ben, who is also a proficient employee. Yay.
right,
Yeah, also
Heidi
when it
knows
comes
about
to, I don't know, can you hear me actually? I'm having
Yeah.
Yes.
issues with the
See you?
mic. Oh, great.
Yeah.
So since this is a bit easier with the modular architecture, and it also has that auto-generate config where you can set it up to update the models, where you do not have that option with the glass mapper unless, for example, you specify it for TDS. So it's kind of similar, but it depends how you want to approach it. And
Well,
I
Leprechaun
think the
will do
synthesis is a
that.
bit
So
faster than glass.
Leprechaun can do the auto generate and updates of Glass models if you set it up. It has
But
a
I
it
think
has
with
a
the
watch.
speed, the synthesis is a bit faster than glass.
Is it?
I think it is. It's
I'm not
not
sure.
that much,
I
but
haven't seen any numbers. But I don't really. I mean, I haven't seen any numbers on this recently. Like, I'm not sure if that's really true. I do know that Glass kind of does avoid the render build pipeline to make itself faster. But with that said, that kind of bakes in HTML generation into some of the Glass classes somewhere in the framework. I think synthesis will call that pipeline. I think.
Okay, we do actually have another question. So every time I keep trying to finish it. So we just have a question here from Jay, if you can see it on screen. Shu and Courtney, I'm going to leave you to this one. Using the or actually, Mike, this might be for you as well. And when using, I'm guessing Leprechaun with TDS, does it, or the code generation with TDS, does it create a huge code file? I'm guessing this is with to do with code generation as well.
And it's just like Luna said, it depends on how you set it up.
People are used to using the out-of-box kind of code generation files with TDS, and obviously they're customizable. So it's probably a good idea to look into customizing them.
Yeah, so it all depends where they want to use the code generation, so on which the project files, if you're using the TDS, and you can also specify per TDS template to inherit certain fields from other projects for code generation as well. So it's really how you set up your solution. So you don't need to have one big blob. And usually what I advise is clean up your T4 or T5 templates. So don't use out of the box ones, because you're going to end up with so much things that you actually do not even need, and it's just heavy. So adjust your T4 and T5 templates and split your project accordingly. So don't have one big bulk of code generation.
If you can put like a source project, the templates as well, to help set up that inheritance structure. But I know I've come across the same thing before with TDS, but like Una said, it's definitely refactor that modify them to suit your needs. Cool.
Yes, so the default settings, what I'm seeing here in the chat, that will cause one big blob and everything will be in one. So adjust your settings and the way how you set the solution.
All right then. Every time I say that I think it looks like we're done, we keep getting more questions. But definitely thank you everybody for your questions. Apologies for the learning experience in getting the question and answer thing going properly, and figuring out how to let everyone speak. So yeah, thanks again. This time I am actually going to end it, and keep an eye out for our session, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.